Hello everyone, my colleague Charitas&Polycarpe and myself we present to you our communication entitled The South Pacific Games on French Oceania, Geopolitical Issues, Power and Influence of France 1947-1971. First of all, Oceania is divided into four regions: Australasia, Micronesia, Melanesia and Polynesia. Oceania, located in the Pacific, is a region of the world that is not a continent strictly speaking, even if geographers assimilate it to a continent. Antome and Bonne-Maison talk about a trundle space. The territories comprising the rest of the continent are independent island archipelagos or territories linked to former colonial powers such as France, United States, United Kingdom. You can see on the map in red the first four editions of the South Pacific Games from 1963 to 1971. To begin, created in 1947 by the Canberra Convention, the South Pacific Commission responded to the desire for security and stability in the region after the Second World War. The six founding colonial powers then present in the South Pacific, United States, Australia, France, New Zealand, Netherlands, United Kingdom, gave the South Pacific Committee a consultative role by stipulating that it should have a technical advisory role, training and research at the service of the member states and island territories, with the aim of managing and preserving the natural resources of the region and promoting economic and social development. Its headquarters were in Nouméa, New Caledonia, in 1949. As such, these six countries that had administered Pacific territories anticipate the benefits they can gain by providing coordinated assistance. It is an organization of strategic regional cooperation. From 1948 to 1971, the first Secretaries General were Australian, British, American, New Zealand, and Samoan. But where are the French in this history of Oceania? Since 1946, the French colonies of Oceania become overseas territories, an extension of metropolitan France of its influence, but as territories of exploitation and not of settlement, unlike the British territories. Then in 1951, the South Pacific Committee's action zone was extended to Guam and the territories under trusteeship of the Pacific Islands, Micronesia. Also in 1955, during the conferences of the South Pacific Commission, the idea of creating a sports competition between the territories of Pacific Oceania is addressed by Numa Dali and Pierre Matro, two New Caledonian sports leaders. For example, at the fourth South Pacific Conference in Papua New Guinea in 1959, the South Pacific Games were created with the proposal of Dr. Sayou Khan of Fiji to host it for its first edition. Thus, in 1961-62, the South Pacific Commission creates the South Pacific Games Committee and its first charter, which will take place every 3 years until the Guam edition in 1975, then every 4 years since that date. The same year, Samoa, then called Western Samoa, gained independence and became the first independent Pacific Island country of the modern era to display its flag and anthem, the others being under mainly British or French territorial domination. As we can see, the South Pacific Games are for post-colonial powers at first. Thus, the 1963 edition takes place in Fiji, British territory, since it is the island that has important sports facilities at that time. Moreover, France is occupied with the French Games in its former colonies in Africa and has not yet turned to its overseas territories of Oceania in terms of sports development. It will devote itself ardently to host the second edition in 1966 at Nouméa in New Caledonia. From then on, the number of countries and athletes represented at the Games until 1971 will only grow concomitantly to the Caledonian sporting power. For example, from 1963 to 2019, New Caledonia, the French sui generis collectivity, won 12 editions of the 16th that took place. Are there results on the hosting of the Games in 1966 and 1971 in two French territories indicative of the stakes of the French influence in Oceania? Do these regional sports games represent for France a geopolitical challenge of strategic redevelopment of its influence in Oceania, and why? In 1963, France took the third overall medals in New Caledonia by territory, behind Fiji and Papua New Guinea. Indeed, after the African independence of the former French colonies, the organization by France of the Friendship Games from 1960 to 1963, the metropolis must now take care of the sports development in its territories in Oceania. First, because it can no longer count on the athletic potential of its former African colonies, and because the disaster of the French Olympic team at the Olympic Games in Rome requires turning to Oceania. This also in order to avoid all wills of independence of the French territories of Oceania, especially since in the project to build a greater Gaulian France, these territories will play a strategic role in the French nuclear umbrella to build its independence from the superpowers. At the same time, in 1963, France transferred its atomic test to Polynesia and in 1964 created the Nuclear Center of Experimentation at Papeete in French Polynesia. Thus, the French policy in Oceania, which had hitherto been characterized by the folly of the British and the Americans, is taking a new turn since the French decolonization in Oceania is experiencing a sudden halt, reversing the essential framework laws. In 1963, the Council of Government was placed under the authority of the governor, and in 1968, the Biot Act deprived the Territorial Assembly of New Caledonia of most of its powers. The stakes in New Caledonia, important natural resources exist as 25% of the world's nickel as well as hydrocarbon deposits. Thus, in 1963, Nouméa proposed to organize the second edition of the Games in 1966. Following a visit by Georges Pompidou, French Prime Minister in Oceania, Maurice Herzog, High Commissioner for Youth and Sports, also goes there. Significant funds were made available to build the sports infrastructure, and senior official experience in organizing the Franco-African Friendship Games were recycled into organizing the Nouméa Games. We can see in the images in the center above General Pierre Biot, Minister of State in charge of the overseas departments and territories, inaugurating the Territorial Olympic Stadium, and below the French Minister of Youth and Sports, François Missoff. In reality, the stakes are high since in the early 1960s, a nuclear test site is being considered in New Caledonia. In fact, the Games concealed a vast plan for the economic and social development of the Caillou in order to stem all separatist wills and preserve French interests in Oceania in the Cold War and in the face of the British and Americans. In this context, France thus becomes the fourth nuclear power, allowing it to assert its independence by leaving NATO in 1960, just after deployed its Alpha Force to Oceania in 1965. Then the Games moved to Papua New Guinea in 1969. According to the rotating logic between Francophone and Anglophone, this British protectorate, placed under the UN authority of Australia, becomes an example not to follow for France in terms of its geopolitics in Oceania. Indeed, the economy of the colony, disarticulated, limits its role to serve as a reservoir of labor, supplier of raw materials on zone of plantations, interwoven in the powerful productive and commercial structures of the Australian metropolis to become a kind of territorial extension overseas. Significant tensions with the indigenous populations are developing, especially as Samoa in 1962, Cook Islands in 1965, Nauru in 1968, Fiji and Tonga in 1970 become independent. The territory of Papua New Guinea will be independent in 1975. Papua New Guinea's strategic importance to the United States and its Australian allies was heightened in the context of the Cold War by the defeat in Vietnam. Faced with this context of the dismantling of the Commonwealth in Oceania, France, which has just hosted the Winter Games in Grenoble in 1968, also building step by step the future of Francophonie, is making its first nuclear test in 1960 in Mururoa and in 1966 and in 1968 the first H-bomb in French Polynesia. Moreover, following May 1968, movements of disputes emerged in New Caledonia and Polynesia that it was appropriate to monitor. Following the ideological and social events linked to May 1968, the Gaullist centralization, the absence of redistribution of land in favor of customary clans, nationalist movements were born in New Caledonia to keep the majority of tribal populations away from economic development or to the succession of independence in the Pacific region in 1970. This fourth edition, however, takes place in Papeete, since the challenge for France is to reaffirm its presence and influence. French Polynesia, in addition to its fishing and maritime potential, ranks France second in the world and includes the French Nuclear Center, which carried out 46 aerial tests in Mururoa and Whangatofa from 1966 to 1974. Here again, behind the games is a vast plan of financing and economic development of French Polynesia. Testimony to the importance of the South Pacific Games for French influence, the above messages of the two French Presidents Charles de Gaulle for Numa in 1966 and Georges Pompidou for Papeete in 1971. As for the African Games initiated by France and later the Indian Ocean Games in 1979 and the Games of La Francophonie in 1989, the argument of friendship plays on the development of territories and attachment to France. Behind the speeches, it is the economic development that passes through the sports infrastructure, since in 1960 France and each French territory invest 241 million francs of the Pacific, and for 1971, 390 million Pacific francs, part of which for Papeete will be provided by the Papeete Nuclear Experimental Center and the support of the French military fleet. Finally, the 2007 South Pacific Games Charter, paraphrasing the Olympic Charter, which insists on sport as a means of development and stability in the region in order certainly for France to ease the separatist tensions by reaffirming the model of assimilation, to preserve its maritime power and the exploitation of natural resources, as well as nuclearize and then denuclearize, giving a status of vulnerability to this area, which make it a strategic position of power for it as for other Western countries. Oceania, which in the 1980s could be described as a black hole for a Pacific destined to become the new center of the world, is more concerned about internal tensions than those that may come from outside. Sport and the games find here a way to maintain the influence of the French power and to contain the wheels of divisions in order to make understand that these territories have more to lose without France. Finally, these games include stakes based on the logic of the red rag to divert attention and prevent internal and external opponents. We thank you for your attention and we are of course open to your questions.